Hi, everyone. I am, hello, everyone. We're doing a second take of the first part of the interview, of the lecture, rather, on Ecocinema and Globalization II. Just a note, this is not going to be required for the exam. I'm very late getting this up, but I did want it there for anyone who is interested in the topic. There is one exam question, one of the many choices for the quotation identification and discussion questions, where you can bring up these films and bring in this material, but it's again optional, so don't sweat it if you don't get to this or have questions about it. So what I wanted to do is just set up a context for the discussion of the films. I've already recorded a lecture that discusses the main films that were featured in this module: Snowpiercer, Mad Max Fury Road, Annihilation, and Awakening. But I do want to talk a little bit about the idea of ecocinema and outline how the science fiction genre is a particularly appropriate way of thinking through some of the issues of ecology and globalization, through the ways in which science fiction works as a form of allegory. So I'll discuss all of this in this very quick lecture. I'm going to start with a few quotations from an essay that is not required reading for you, but it's part of my own research, and I think it's an interesting perspective on the idea of ecocinema. It's Q.Y. Chu from an article called Ecocinema in the Oxford Bibliographies. And Chu writes, with a world increasingly characterized by unimaginable environmental threats, cinematic representations of eco-dystopian worlds are seen in two particular fantasy genres, namely science fiction and horror films, unquote. So what Chu is pointing to here is the ways in which we live in a world in which we have environmental threats, a sense of the entire globe being threatened. And so often, one way of processing that sense of threat is through cinematic representations of eco-dystopian worlds. That is, imaginary worlds that show the possible degradation that environmental destruction is causing. Dystopia being the opposite of utopia. The idea of a perfect place. A dystopia is a kind of nightmare space. And fantasy genres are important. They're formulaic stories, like all genres, but they depict fantasy spaces. Science fiction and horror have a lot of overlap, and I'll get to that in a moment, but they also have important differences. And what Chu is saying is that both science fiction and horror, by representing these eco-dystopian worlds, provide an interesting perspective on them. Quote, the genre is in a near ideal position to, quote, visualize and visceralize speculative future worlds. And that phrase is from Wieck von Mossner. But that idea that science fiction and horror visualize and visceralize is an important distinction. I'll complete the quote. So the genre is in a near ideal position to visualize and visceralize speculative future worlds that bring along risks and anxieties under large-scale environmental changes. So the risks and anxieties that are being depicted and that in some ways we're feeling right now, science fiction films and horror films were aware of the ways in which they visualize, right? They provide a representation of something. But the idea that they visceralize, give us a kind of gut reaction, a feeling in relationship to that world, is also important. And I think Snowpiercer and Mad Max Fury Road, in their excess of cinematic style, the amazing visual worlds, the sound textures, Mad Max Fury Road especially, is an amazing film in terms of its editing and mise-en-scène and production design. You really get a feeling for the world. And so the idea that you would viscerally understand the speculative future world is an important thing that cinema provides in trying to make us understand ecological threats. Finally, Chu writes, ecofilm scholars are eager to advocate a shift beyond human-centered perspectives in perceiving the world. And I'll come to this in the second lecture that I've already recorded when discussing films like Annihilation and even to some extent Awakening. The idea that we can think outside of a human-centered or anthropomorphized sense of a world think about the ways in which objects, nature itself, may have a will of its own. And that's something that ecological film scholars can open up. All right, so very quickly, let's look at science fiction as a genre. These are quotations. It's a quotation from Looking at Movies, our textbook. And science fiction is defined as something that deals with humanity's relationship with science and the technology it generates. And specifically, what happens when humanity, quote, uses science and technology to play God, unquote. Science fiction always has to have some connection to science and technology. And there's a long tradition going back to Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, stories of scientists using technology to create life. And the whole subset of artificial intelligence, science fiction as a subgenre, really deals with those questions. But like all genres, science fiction acts as a social myth. It's an idealized and simplified story, a formula story that expresses the fears and fantasies of society. And science fiction especially often literalizes the fears and fantasies of the effects of technology on the world. Now, to go back to Thomas Schatz, who was the writer that we were looking at in relationship to genre theory, Schatz says, what is so fascinating and confounding about Hollywood genre films is their capacity to, quote, play it both ways, unquote, to both criticize and reinforce the values, beliefs, and ideals of our culture within the same narrative context, unquote. And this is, I think, happening in the films that I've chosen for this module. And on one level, these are films critical of the effects of technology. Snowpiercer depicts a world that has been plunged into frozen polar waste due to a failed experiment that attempted to correct climate change. And the Road Warrior series, the Mad Max series, depicts a world devastated by nuclear war and ecological destruction. So there's a criticism of high technology and the way in which that works. But there's also a way in which it reinforces certain values, beliefs, and ideals, including the belief that heroes can come along and somehow break the systems that have been built up. And with science and technology, there's a criticism of science and technology and sci-fi, but there's also ways in which we enjoy the textures of it, right? The scale and beauty and power of the imaginative worlds that science fiction create for us are often through technology. So that's an interesting kind of contradiction, a way in which the genre has it both ways. Here's a quotation from the textbook, Looking at Movies, that talks about the relationship between science fiction and horror films, two genres that are connected but are slightly different. So, quote, horror films speak to our fears of the supernatural and the unknown, whereas science fiction films explore our dread of technology and change. Both genres have their roots in folklore that articulates the ongoing battle between human beings and everything that is other than human. In ancient folklore, this other was anthropomorphized into monsters, trolls, ogres that inhabited and represented the wilderness that humans could not control. So horror films often have a sense of a kind of deep dread of natural forces or supernatural forces literalized in monstrous form that reflects the ways in which human beings are subject to things that happen in nature that we don't have any control over. In some ways, the COVID-19 crisis that we're dealing with is a perfect example of a horror film, right? A tiny virus, something we can't control and don't understand, is the other, which is threatening all of us and causing massive upheaval in the world. Now, horror films have a long tradition that go into ancient mythology, and it's often this idea of the supernatural and the unknown. Science fiction takes that same idea of an unknown force, but often puts it in a technological or scientific frame. So to continue the quotation, ironically, the same advances in science and technology that allowed cultures to explain away and thus destroy all of these old monsters have given voice to the modern folklore of science fiction. For most of us, science is beyond our control. It is another as well. And that can help us, but also has the power to destroy us. So in some ways, a lot of these same ancient fears that are articulated through the horror film find a different form in science fiction. So there's both differences and overlaps between the two genres. A particular subgenre of science fiction is the post-apocalyptic subgenre. There are a lot of different forms of science fiction film. Um, I mentioned the artificial intelligence or sort of robot subgenre. There's subgenres that deal with the kind of space opera or militarization of future worlds. The post-apocalyptic subgenre is an important one in which we see a world after, we see how human beings adapt to a world that has been destroyed. But what is an apocalypse? Okay, I'm going to give you two definitions here from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. The most precise one relates to how apocalypse is one of the Jewish and Christian writings of 200 BC to AD 150, marked by pseudonymity, symbolic imagery, and the expectation of an imminent cosmic cataclysm in which God destroys the ruling powers of evil and raises the righteous to life in a messianic kingdom. And the last book of the Christian Bible, Revelation, there's an account of the apocalypse, the end of the world. But it's an end of the world in which human beings kind of have it coming. They're punished for their sins, and evil is destroyed through a good power, but a good power that is also highly destructive. That very specific religious meaning of apocalypse is more generalized into the idea of apocalypse as simply a great disaster. And the dictionary actually provides, as an example, an environmental apocalypse. And in some ways, climate change that we're experiencing right now in the world is a slow motion apocalypse. And the devastation that is going to be wrought in the next 100 years as a result of climate change is something that is like a slow motion apocalypse. Now, within the science fiction, there are sometimes apocalyptic films, disaster films like The Day After Tomorrow, in which we see a kind of end of the world. But the post-apocalyptic film depicts a world after that destruction, and it shows humanity after the disaster has already happened. Post-apocalyptic films tend to be about the ways in which societies reorganize themselves after major crisis. We can also think about the post-apocalyptic film as an allegory. An allegory is a specific form of storytelling that, again, has an ancient tradition. You can think of the Bible and a lot of ancient myths as allegories. Again, the dictionary definition of allegory is that it's the expression by means of symbolic fictional figures and actions of truths or generalizations about human existence. So what we have is kind of a story that's speaking to us with two voices. There's a kind of diegetic universe in which we have characters and actions, but they're highly symbolic. They're often highly unrealistic. What they're really saying is something about human existence. So the real story concerns assertions about human existence, lessons with political, ethical, environmental, and so on stakes. So Snowpiercer is obviously a kind of absurd setup, right? The idea of some train that is as a perpetual motion machine making its way around the world. That's not a realistic diegesis, but in fact, it is a story about classes. It is a story about current human society. It's a story about authoritarian political rule. It's a story about what happens when human beings are totally shut off from nature. That's what it's really about. And there's a kind of ridiculous armature of the story that is often commonplace that we find with allegory. Similarly, Mad Max Fury Road is an excessive story, right? There's nothing realistic about it. There was a kind of visceral quality to it, and the fact that the production team shot a lot of the stunts in with real action as opposed to using CGI does give it a real texture. But in fact, it's an allegory of a world without law and the ways in which force, brutality, and in this case, patriarchy and environmental destruction cause enormous harm. That's what the real story behind the film. So both Snowpiercer and Mad Max Fury Road are allegories of human existence in the absence of a balance with nature. Snowpiercer, the setup of the film is that it's post-climate change. Mad Max Fury Road, it's post-nuclear war and environmental disaster. And so the lessons of the film are the ways in which human beings suffer as a result of those disasters, the kind of terrible structures that get set up politically, and the ways in which individual heroes can try and fight that and try and insert different kinds of human values into the equation. I'll stop it there. And in the second half of the lecture, there are some discussions of the 4 films. Thank you very much for listening.